Yeah.
let's do that. Okay, Faith,
Mm,
let's get formally started with this recording. So yeah, I'm here with Mr. Faith Abiodun. Is that correct? How you pronounce it? Abiodun,
correct. That's correct.
a fellow Orange man. That's what people who go to Syracuse are called. So we connected through the Syracuse network, and we both have been to the Maxwell School of Syracuse University. And Faith is currently in South Africa, doing some
Mm.
very interesting work in youth leadership development. And I will let him introduce himself, and then we can get started with the interview. Go ahead.
Thank you. Well, lovely to connect with you and to have this chat with your class, and really excited to have this opportunity. And Syracuse was a great experience for me, getting to work with fellow development professionals from all over the world, really learning the US way and learning and bringing global perspectives as well to the classroom. So that was a fantastic experience, and I'm glad that we can connect again through that background. I moved to South Africa actually within 2 months of graduating from Syracuse, and I've been here for almost 9 years now.
Wow,
Uh,
that's impressive.
yeah, and traveling to South Africa for the first time, coming off out of the US, I had, I'll say, expectations about what the experience would be like because I
Hmm.
grew up in Nigeria, and I'd heard things about South Africa, how it's as close as you will get to Europe in Africa, right?
Interesting.
And
Okay.
then arriving in South Africa and realizing, yes, there is that.
Hmm.
But on the other hand, South Africa has its own unique challenges as well.
Of course. Yeah.
So I'll be happy to share those perspectives in the course of
Hmm.
our conversation.
Of course, of course. Well, no, again,
Yeah,
thanks for that background. I think that helps
yeah,
contextualize the conversation. And also,
yeah.
it's very, let's start off by first understanding what development means to you as someone who
Mm,
grew up in Nigeria and now you're living in South Africa and you've seen these ideas play out even in the
mm,
West. So, what is your
mm.
personal experience of this word development and this concept? And how does it differ from region to region? Many of our students have probably never been to Africa, so I think it'll
Yeah.
help contextualize that idea.
Mm. I've had the great fortune of traveling,
Hmm.
in all the regions of the continent. I've been in the north, east, west, and south, and probably 20 plus countries now across the continent that I've been able to see. And it helps a lot when you see things for yourself rather than when you read about them or watch movies that
Hmm.
either glorify them or completely dehumanize them. My understanding of the word development, actually my introduction to the word development came from living in a country that was classed a third world country or an
Hmm.
underdeveloped country. And I grew up, in Western Nigeria. My dad had a massive bookshelf, and one of the prominent books on my dad's bookshelf was How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. Right. So you grow up in this part of the world thinking, yeah, we are the underdeveloped ones, right? We are the ones who haven't yet made it. And growing up in a country that has huge aspirations, but each citizen realizes there's almost a cap to their ability to dream, right? There's a cap to your ability to imagine what you could become,
Hmm.
because the journey to access basic amenities is longer for you than it is for other people. You can't always switch on the tap and drink clean water,
Hmm.
right? You can always switch on the light and the lights come on. So the fact that you have to arrange your life around a reality that perhaps you are not able to move as quickly as you would like to access the dreams that you have for yourself, that begins to reflect underdevelopment,
Hmm.
right? So when a child cannot go to school once they turn the age of 4 or 5, that's not development,
Sure.
right? When a person can't, plug their phones to the, in the socket and expect that in a little bit your phone is charged up, that's not development. So I always start from the basic access to amenities, things that make life livable. And then when you go beyond that, it's the ability to access the dreams that you've always had for yourself. Can I apply for a job and expect a fair shot at that
Hmm.
job? Can I pick up my international passport and expect that I can travel without jumping through hoops? It's the little things. First of all, can I exist? Do I have basic freedoms? Is life livable? And then when you get beyond that, can I dream?
Sure.
And can I access those dreams? And that's always where I start with about development.
Hmm. And related to the first question, how does this concept of aspirations or achieving even a basic level of dignity differ between economies and countries in Africa? And again, we understand that nation states are more modern entities, uh, and like you rightly said, within a country you could have within 10 miles a vast
Yeah.
difference in terms of how people live. But more generally speaking, how have you seen that play out between different countries?
Yeah. So, for instance, if you travel in parts of East Africa, let's say Malawi, for instance, as you are flying into the country and as your plane is, lowering itself into the capital Lilongwe, you see perhaps just vast brown land.
Hmm.
And you begin to ask yourself, how developed might this country be? Right. And it's a subtle thought that just plays in your mind because you don't see images that match what you've seen in other countries. You don't see the skyscrapers immediately. You don't see the massive airport. You don't see all of those things. But then you realize, okay, when I arrive in the country, there is a quality of life of citizens that may not be directly tied to the physical infrastructure that we've come to equate
Hmm.
with development. Physical infrastructure plays a huge role in making society come alive. But a society can equally exist without mirroring the images of development we've seen in other parts of the world.
Sure.
So across Africa, the differences are vast and they're equally, within reach. You can see, for instance, when I travel in East Africa, I always feel like I've been here before, even if it's my first time there, right? Because I see a city that resembles another city I've been in, and I can
Right.
think, this reminds me of Zambia, or this
Hmm.
reminds me of Gambia, or this reminds me of Togo. So physical infrastructure is one thing that connects us across the continent. Our infrastructure is not at the same level as what you will come to expect in Europe and America and many parts of Asia. So that's on the one hand. On the other hand, we're equally connected by lots of historical challenges
Hmm.
because almost every African country has gone through a similar experience of colonialism and having to fight for independence and having to rebuild long after the rest of the world has built,
Sure.
right? We still haven't had our own industrial revolution in
Hmm.
Africa, right? And you think about the industrial revolution as a long time ago for the rest of the world, but we haven't caught up yet. So there are historical challenges that many countries across the continent are dealing with. But on the other hand, the desire and the will to achieve within our means and far beyond our means, I find that drive to be very, very common across the continent. So you can compare apples to apples at one level in terms of what countries look like physically.
Hmm.
But when you come within each country, you realize there's a common desire to achieve.
Sure, of course. Now let's use that as a segue to the next question that I have, which is in terms of contributing to that material aspect of development that you've been talking about.
Yeah.
What role does the government or private sector play? And do you generally see, like in the West, or I mean, I grew up in Asia, I grew up in India, right? So my understanding is, at least since the 1990s, there has been a
Mm,
huge focus on the private sector in terms of the government saying, okay, we need privatization, we need more resources from outside. So the whole,
yeah.
narrative that goes with development and liberalization. Do you see a similar thing playing out in Africa? And my guess is yes. The limited travel I've done in Africa, I see
Mm,
that playing out in some ways. So what is a mix
mm,
of that rhetoric between government and
mm.
private sector across the countries that you worked in?
Yeah. First of all, you need a very strong private sector to achieve or attain any of the standards of development that we can imagine for ourselves, right? America's society, America's development story, if we agree that it is a developed society, was built on the back of a private sector, right? You need steel companies to be able to do their thing. You need iron companies. You need every aspect of industry to be strong. So first of all, no society can thrive without a private sector. Let's get that clear. And the strength of the private sector on the continent is not where it can be. It hasn't yet hit potential. But the role of that private sector has got to be, first of all, creating opportunities for people who are coming up in society. You need to be able to access those opportunities to build on the promise that you had shown, perhaps through your education. right? So firstly, you're looking at private sector to provide opportunities for citizens, without which there will be massive frustrations and you just can't get by in society. Secondly, you need the private sector to produce what society needs, right? When we talk about physical infrastructure, one of the most disheartening parts of development on the continent is that critical sectors in the economy are still being largely staffed by non-Africans,
Mm-hmm.
right? You're looking at the construction industry. At the highest level of professionalism, you're getting workers from China, you're getting workers from India, you're getting workers from Lebanon, from Pakistan, from all other countries, driving critical elements of the industry. That doesn't leave much for local citizens, because where you have non-African companies leading the biggest infrastructure projects on the continent, that revenue is being shipped out of the continent, right? And it's not seeping into society. You're not patronizing local employees, you're not patronizing local vendors, etc. So it's a huge challenge within the private sector in itself. Can we strengthen each industry? There you bring in the question of the role of government, right? Government's role is to stimulate production at a local level such that that private sector can thrive and allow opportunity to seep down far beyond the highest levels into individual homes and into villages, right? So government has a huge role to play in enacting policies, right? In prioritizing local production, in working with foreign partners to strengthen the capacity locally, right? Because you can't go ultimately protectionist and close your door off to the rest of the world. There's a balance, and we have examples of economies that have gone 100% protectionist, patronize the local industry 100% and no one else. You might have picked up the African Continental Free Trade Area as an emerging area of focus on the continent. Can we stimulate production and growth and trade within the continent to strengthen local economies? So I see the role of government as enabler, right? Create the environment, help to build the infrastructure, put the right policies in place, support citizens, and then the role of private sector with the support of government is to ensure that production capacity in every sector is at the highest it can be, so that you're creating opportunity for every citizen to live their lives at the highest level possible.
Okay, that's good. Can you give me one or two examples could be from different countries, of places where this has been done somewhat well, if not ideally? Yes.
I think about Morocco
Okay.
on the continent is one of the countries that on balance appears to have many things going well, right? Now, Morocco, unlike many of the countries in Africa, is a monarchy, right? Not a dictatorial system, not a democratic system, it's a monarchy. But in my experience of traveling in Morocco and working with citizens and seeing the society for itself, you get a sense that on balance, the country is tracking in the right direction. You've got a strong private sector, right? You've got a strong education system within the country. The government is fairly stable. Perhaps it helps that it's a monarchy, right? There's a level of stability. So politically, the country is stable. Economically, the country is thriving. And socially, no country is perfect. We know that. We've been around. But you see a sense that citizens can afford to aspire, afford to dream, and get on with their lives. You come to a country like South Africa, which is in many cases multiple countries in one, right? South Africa is reputed to be the most unequal country in the world, which means you've got the gap between the richest of the rich and the poorest of the poor is the widest of any country on earth.
I thought that was the US, but yeah, it's good to
it is South Africa.
Okay.
You look at the Human Development Index and the Gini coefficient, and South Africa ranks really, really poorly, which means you've got super rich, wealthy people, and you've got the ultra poor in the same society. So how do you define that as a developed country or not a developed country, right? So South Africa has, because of its history of racial difference and its history of apartheid and subjugation, you've got people who live a very, very different reality from other people, and you can almost split that line in half by race. So the challenge there is, does the country work for people politically? Not really, because the agitation for representation is always going to be high, right? People of a particular demographic are saying we're never represented in government and we want to be represented, right? Economically, you look at the access to opportunity where you've got youth unemployment or unemployment generally ranking 30% and above. That's never a good situation, right? When you look at education in itself, when you look at the failure rate in schools, you're definitely concerned, how will these people ever drive an economy forward if they're not scoring 30% and above across board in academically? So the indices of development don't rank very well, but within the country you've got almost two separate demographics and obviously lots in between. So I can contrast those as, on the one hand, you've got a society that tends to do well, almost above average in everything else. Rwanda will be another good case study for you. As one that has really, really turned the corner in the last 20 plus years, and is now, doing very, very well across indices. But the continent is massive. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, Faith, let me push back a little bit on that, on what you're sharing. Again, I agree with much of what you're saying, but what if the way we are defining development is purely materialistic? And again, I'm not trying to be a saint sitting on a mountain and meditating the whole day, but if our metrics of development are entirely materialistic, then aren't we missing something? There is, of course, Amartya Sen, who made the famous argument that there's also human development and other factors. You might have all the riches in the world, but you may be dealing with massive depression, mental health issues, and other things, which we are seeing in other parts of the world. So what is your take on that? Do you think the way the definition of development we use generally in the development space needs a little more nuancing, or it needs a little more careful thinking in terms of how do vast majority of the people think? Again, I don't mean to speak for everyone in the world, but I'm assuming that there are.
It's a good point.
There are people out even in parts of India or other parts who may not agree with our discussion, right? They might say, "Hey, what are these guys talking about?" Right?
Correct. I read the news yesterday about the rise in suicide rates in Japan, right? And I forget the exact stat, but it was about almost like a 15% increase in suicide rates among women, in particular in Japan. And by all indices, we will rank Japan as a highly developed country, right? If we were to go by the indices that are available in the world, we say, oh, Japan has got everything, right? Infrastructure, education, economic development, etc. But suicide rates speak to a specific aspect of society that we have to unpack, and we are not good at unpacking what leads people in that direction. We're not good at it. On the flip side, when I grew up in Nigeria, we were reputed to be the happiest people on earth, right? In the 80s and 90s, Nigerians are the happiest people on earth. So what is going on? You've got a society that will be classified as undeveloped or underdeveloped or third world, and you can rank those people as the happiest on earth. And you take another society that on the surface level looks as though everything is terrific, but people may be not the happiest on earth because something is driving them in a particular direction. So yeah, the conversation about development is very nuanced, but what should not be in doubt is the ability of every citizen on earth to aspire to the qualities of the right to life, the right to liberty, the right to to dream and to access those dreams wherever you live on earth. The society in which you live does a lot to shape your mind and your ability to imagine and your ability to pursue. So when you look at the advancements that we talk about in the world, today we're talking about, we even moved past artificial intelligence. It's almost a given that the world now runs on artificial intelligence, and we're trying to explore the boundaries of human capacity. How much of that is happening in African countries versus non-African countries, right? So we can't look at African countries and say, oh, the people look happy, right? And happiness by itself is relative. You can be happy because you don't know you could have more, and you don't have the capacity to have more. Therefore, you're content with what you have, right? And people shouldn't look at that as, well, those people are good. Why bother help them even more? Or why bother encourage them to want more? So it's a very, very nuanced conversation. And I don't think the world is good at analyzing what classifies as a developed society, we look at the metrics, the surface level materialistic things, because they're easier to measure. And you can count the number of houses that have roofs. You can count the number of households that can access clean water. Those things are easy to measure. It's the things that we can't measure that are the most difficult.
Sure, no, that's a good point you raise, and I'm glad we're also able to agree on that part.
Yeah,
So in terms
definitely.
of young people, I mean, I think I consider you young. I'm 39. I'm also, I think, almost young. So I think what role do you,
Just past the age qualified that qualifies as
I know
young.
exactly, but yeah, I'm young at heart, and I think like a
Yeah,
young person. So
yeah.
what role do young people have in shaping this debate of
Mm,
development? And also,
mm,
especially now, at least in the West, there's been a lot of self-reflection, in
mm,
terms of how are we thinking about issues of equity, diversity, and all
mm,
these things. And those
mm,
conversations also are seeping into international development and international aid. And
mm,
those sectors also, as you pointed out rightly earlier, a lot of Africans do not have a voice in the development process, right? They're at the
mm,
receiving end and are seen as almost just beneficiaries who are passive, and we need to have these those are the stereotypes that exist, right, about Africa,
mm,
Asia, and other parts of the world. So in that
mm,
sense, what role do you think young people have in shaping
mm.
this debate? Again, of course, there are role models or people who are visible like yourself, who
Yeah.
can shape that debate, and you speak both languages, literally and figuratively, right? In the sense you've been educated in the West, and you
Yeah.
can speak to that audience. So
Yeah.
how do you see your own role in this process, and
Mm,
what have
mm,
you been able to sort of convey
mm,
or speak to
yeah. Yeah.
audiences in helping better understand this?
Mm. I think the first role that every young person has is to educate themselves about the issues,
Hmm.
and to do that beyond what formal institutions can provide, right? I often say that you cannot change what you don't understand.
Hmm.
And no matter how much effort you put in from where you are, you need to really understand how the world is being shaped, the world immediately around you, within your country, your local society, and then the rest of the globe, so that you are aware what the trends are, you're aware where the pressure points are, what the factors are that make the world move in one direction or the other. So the more information and awareness you have, the better positioned you are to engage in the system, right? So for me, the first
Hmm.
level is always, how much do you understand about the world in which you live? The second role I believe the young people have is to begin to explore how things can be done differently,
Hmm.
right? The more awareness you have about development, about issues, the more you have to begin to question, where you are and how different can things be. So there's got to be a questioning heart in young people. Why do we look at Africa the way we look at Africa, right? Why do we talk about human development the way we talk about human development, right? We were talking just now about just the nuances, right, in quality of life, and what counts and what doesn't count. Why is it this way? Why is it not that way? And how could it be done differently? And then the third role for young people would be to begin to engage systems.
Hmm.
Things don't change by themselves. Things have always changed on the edge of pressure, where someone decides, I now know more than I knew. I've now explored how things are and how much better they could be. And I'm willing to fight to make that change happen. I'm willing to play a role and not just be passive about it. So I see young people working at all of those levels in society today, right? And I have played a role for years now in helping to shape the minds of young people around the issues. When I moved to Johannesburg, my first role at African Leadership Academy, where I spent 8 years,
Hmm.
was to begin to think about what is the curriculum that people are learning that helps them understand this international development space that we live in, that we operate in,
Hmm.
right? And if there are gaps, I have to help to fill those gaps, because the next generation of African leaders is growing up, and we can't afford for them to not know what we didn't know 10 years ago or 20 years ago.
Sure.
So that information and awareness is absolutely key. And I guess a spark then lights up in you when you realize that's how things really are. Why? Right?
Hmm.
You've then got that ability to question and to push back and to think, maybe I've been brought to this level so that I can make a difference. What is that difference? Right?
Sure.
And then we need to support people to be able to engage systems either through the private sector, you know, run an enterprise and make it super successful. If it's a non-profit, develop a nonprofit, find the support, and make it super successful. If you're going to go in the public sector, be able to do that as well at the highest level. That's how I see the role of young people.
Okay, very cool. No, thank you. That's helpful, and also a very optimistic view of how things can be done, right? So let's. This is
Definitely.
not on our list, but I was curious to know which how has your COVID experience been? This is sort of off the.
Mm.
If you want, we can make it off the record, but we can include it if you
No,
wish.
let's
But
have it.
how?
Yeah.
Yeah, how has your COVID experience been in South Africa, and how's your family doing in Nigeria? I'm assuming some
Mm.
of them are in Nigeria, and
Correct.
so how has that experience been for you? And I'm sure you're reading about how the US is handling or mishandling some of these things. So just curious to if you want to share
Yeah,
that part.
definitely. It's been fascinating to be on this side of the world,
Hmm.
watching US news and seeing how mismanagement can lead a crisis to become far worse than it could have been,
Sure.
right? And knowing that we are typically the case studies for that,
Hmm.
it's fascinating to see a very, very different live case study. Lots of factors have, played a role in the spread of COVID. And South Africa has not had the easiest time
Hmm.
dealing with the crisis. And I think this very much reflects that conundrum within society, how different was asked to go into lockdown. And we had 3 days notice of a national lockdown and all of that. And on the one hand, you see a reality in which people are unable to go into a hard lockdown, right?
Hmm.
I think you missed me there for a second, did you?
Yeah, yeah. You're back though.
Um,
Your audio did come through though. Yeah.
all right. Okay. Yeah. I was. Oh, I see. I was saying, right, you see a situation in which where there's the expectation for everyone to go into lockdown to preserve lives and preserve livelihoods. Not everyone can do that.
Hmm. Sure.
That's when you begin to realize how terrible homelessness is. You begin to realize that people don't have enough money to stock up food for, right? And so there are lots of people who gather their daily livelihoods on the street every
Sure.
single day. And there are others who have resources for generations. So South Africa's caseload almost spiked far more than it should have because of the differences in society.
Hmm.
And so luckily, and I often feel very guilty about it when you run the statistics and you look at the wealth ratio in the country. The fact that someone like me will be classed as being in the top 5 or top 10% of earners in the country. And I think, really? I don't earn anything remotely close to what I would consider upper class. But
Right.
when you look at the number of people who don't earn anything close to what I earn, you
Hmm.
feel a weight of responsibility
Sure.
about just what society looks like. Nigeria has been a much, much different case
Hmm.
for some reason. And I think the inability to test at a high level
Hmm.
leads to an artificial sense of what the real caseload is.
True.
And so Nigerians are going about their lives in a slightly different way than the rest of us have.
Yeah.
But you also, when you hear the cases of people who have gotten sick and how bad it has been, you
Hmm.
realize this has not been an easy time for anyone in the world. But thankfully, we're doing very well.
Sure.
We're able to
Yeah.
keep moving. Yeah.
That's good, Faith. No, good. This is a good conversation. Let's pause the conversation, the recording